There are millions of acres of opportunity out there. They belong to you. Every day, decisions are being made that affect your land, your water, your wildlife. You should know about them. This is your mountain. Welcome, everybody, to the Your Mountain podcast. I'm your host, David Willms. With me, as always, Mike McGrady.
Hey, Dave.
Hey, Mike. And Nephi Cole.
I'm still here.
We're going to come up with a better intro for Nephi than I'm still here. Anyway, we're really excited today about our guest. We have Amy Roberts is joining us today. She's the executive director of the Outdoor Industry Association. Amy, thanks for being here.
Thanks a lot for having me on and coming down to Boulder to talk to us.
Oh, you know, Boulder is beautiful. And we were talking on the way down here. I thought Boulder would be a great place to live if it weren't for all these people.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it's just beautiful. So
yeah. Well, I live in Golden, so I try to live where the real people are living in Colorado. So
nice. Good call on that one.
Yeah, I've got family in Golden, so I'll give you credit for that one. So tell us a little bit about yourself. I mean, before we get to what you do, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get involved in the outdoor recreation world?
Sure. Well, I think I'm like a lot of people who came into the industry with different skill set, not necessarily outdoor recreation, but that's where I was spending all my free time on the weekend. So I was fortunate to grow up with some great mentors in my family that took me camping and climbing. And I grew up in Colorado, so of course there's a lot of peaks to bag. And my mom's two uncles, or my mom's brothers, or my uncles, took me out quite a bit. And so I did some peaks with them. And then I lived in Boise, and I was really interested in rock climbing at that time. So I spent about 10 years climbing, and I actually was working at Micron Technology then, and I took a year off. I quit my job and took a year off to go climbing when I was in my early 30s. And my dad was so horrified because I had stock options. It was a really good paying job. But I just knew that I had enjoyed my time there, but I really wanted that time off. And so I took a year off. I lived down in Vegas, climbed a lot of red rocks. I did some peaks in Nepal, and then I spent the summer in Yosemite, and then I ran out of money. So I moved back to Colorado, and I started looking for a job in the outdoor industry because I felt like, I wanted to bring my personal passion in line with what I was doing for work.
So I got to tell you, taking time off you said in your early 30s, I think you've done what everybody dreams of doing. Right? I've always had this thought about it. So I have a friend that did something similar. I think we all know him. Took a year off to go climbing, actually, as well, all over the world. And I had just this enormous amount of jealousy because when you think about it, we are in school for 22 years. Then we go get a job, and we're doing that. And by the time we finally are to the point where, now we can go recreate, maybe we don't have the stamina or endurance that we'd like to have, and maybe we're not fortunate to make it to retirement.
This is a debate I consistently have with my better half, which is that, kind of that thought of like the temperance. And I had a professor who always used to say, all things in moderation, including moderation. Mm-hmm. And to me, I said, you know what, like in life, there's, you plan for the future, but if you don't enjoy today, what's to say that you have that future? I think that's the fine line that we all try and walk, right? It's just trying to figure out, okay, how much playing can I do today and still afford to play tomorrow too? And it's a balancing act.
It is. So before we started this podcast, you were telling us that you had climbed, 14 years in Colorado?
Yeah, I've probably done 10 or 12 during the time I've been here.
So what was your favorite one?
I would say my favorite was probably Kit Carson because it's a really interesting 14er. You actually have to go over Challenger Point, so you go over another 14er to get to it. And it has a great ramp around it and also just the experience, right? So I was with my uncle, Jim, on that one, and I've done a bunch of peaks with him, but I think we got lost on the way in, and so we finally summited, but then we were late coming out. And I just remember walking through the dark, and the mosquitoes had gotten really bad. And this guy was approaching us, and he had this huge mosquito net on, walking. He looked like, something out of a graveyard, basically. And so it's like those experiences. And I think Jim actually fell on the descent and was all banged up. So it's usually the experiences that you have. And yeah, I mean, that definitely got me started. And then after that, I did more technical climbing. But, talking about taking that year off, I mean, it was a difficult decision because there's like fear of the unknown. And what are you going to do to your career? And you're making a certain amount of money. But I also, I put all my stuff in storage. And I really lived out of my car. And it made me understand, like, you really don't need a lot. And I didn't miss any of it. And so then when I knew, okay, I need to get back into, working, it also gave me some understanding of what it's like to have life move a little bit slower and be able to think things through instead of always moving at this fast pace that we do now. And I think it's even faster now because with technology, decisions get made more quickly and you're constantly on. So I reflect back quite a bit on that time and, especially the friends that I made. So I think it's worth it. And I think you just have the idea that it's all going to work out, and it will.
So are you gonna do another one?
Maybe at some point. Hopefully I'm just nearing the end of having to work. So.
So I have a question about climbing because I climb as well. I mean, I love it, and I don't have the time to do it like I want to anymore. And maybe my location is probably not ideal. There's some decent climbing up around Vitavue. I live in Cheyenne, Wyoming. So, but what I went to school in Logan, Utah, and I used to spend so much time in Logan Canyon. So I'm curious how often you get out to sport climb now.
Now I really don't do it anymore at all. And I feel like, it was that 10-year period where that's what I did after work, like a couple days a week after work, and then on the weekends, and then I took that year off and that's all the only thing I did. And I had to work really hard to be able to, lead 5'10", maybe some easy 5'11s. And so I think it's also difficult when you don't go as often. You start to slide backwards on your skill set. Or, I think it's also safety, right? You have to be out there practicing all the time just for the safety factor, placing gear, tying knots, that type of thing.
What's your highest rating you've climbed?
Probably 11B. Yeah. So.
It's like speaking Greek to me. You guys are going to
have
to
climb sometime. We climb at the same level now,
which is nothing like the most amazing climbers.
Yeah.
But I feel like a weekend climber can probably learn to lead 5'10". Unless you're really special, and it just shows how impressive it is to be able to climb, 5'13", 5'14".
I did a 12C once, and I thought I'd climbed Everest.
Yeah,
I thought I was the coolest guy on earth, and so
I climbed one time in high school. My high school Spanish teacher organized this group to go climbing, and the way I convinced my parents to let me go, he said he had this buddy that was leading the climb. And I just told my parents he was a certified climbing instructor. Turns out at the time there was no such thing. It was just some guy that liked to climb. And so that was my experience. And then when my folks found out that I had kind of made up this story about the level of instruction we were going to have, I wasn't allowed to go again. And then it was cost prohibitive to get into for me in college. Mm-hmm. So I just never did it again.
Yeah. Well, with the gear, and I think, though, you move on to different things, right? Now, because now I'm more likely to go to have mountaineering, and then I'll actually ski more than I did in the past. But I feel like, across all those pursuits, like you might focus, okay, what's the hardest climb I did? But really you think about your time, like the experience you had, and most of the memories are about your friends. So that experience with these other people, I think are what sticks out for me. And, those people I made friends with that year, I still stay in touch with, even if I don't see them as frequently now.
It's cool that you bring that up because, isn't that the common experience of the great outdoors? Is that, there's these things that we do that individually, we could pick these different activities that we do. But when we all come back together around the campfire, if you will, we have these common experiences with this common frame of reference, which is, the sky is our ceiling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think whether you have a great day or you get hailed on or someone gets hurt or no one gets hurt, you're always going to remember, that outing. And, those memories stick out for me much more than, any day I spent in the office. So I think that's the thing when you're thinking about if you're going to take time off, it to that point, if you can take it off when you're younger. And so my son actually is 25, and he just graduated from college a couple years ago. And when he came back to Colorado, I told him, like, you should take a year off before you look for a job, because I wanted him to go out and climb, and he was able to go do Rainier and some other things. And because I just know, like, once you get the job, it's really difficult. And so, I mean, that's one thing I would tell my younger self is actually take the gap year, whether it's before high school or, or before college or before you get a job. So,
well, you said you were a little bit nervous taking that leap and taking that time off, but it appears to me that you landed on your feet pretty well. So how did you get involved in the Outdoor Industry Association?
Well, when I first moved back to Colorado, I was looking for a job in the outdoor industry, and so I started working at Bicycle Colorado, which I was doing marketing. And Bicycle Colorado is basically the state, the advocacy organization in the state for bicyclists. And I had the advocacy background because I had already, done quite a bit of that when I worked at Micron, and I worked for the governor in Idaho. So I had that background, and I was able to take that skill set and just apply it to, lobbying basically for bike paths. And then a job came open at OIA, and it was part-time. So I applied, and the VP at that time didn't call me back. And then finally I got a hold of her, and she said, well, it seems like you have too much experience for this position. And so I explained that, hey, I don't care if it's part-time. I just want to get my foot in the door. And so, she gave me that opportunity, and I was here for about a year doing the part-time job, and then she left. And so then I got hired into her role initially as the VP of Government Affairs.
So maybe we can back up a little bit and tell us a little more about the association. So what is the Outdoor Industry Association? And then, we kind of talk a lot about sportsmen's issues. And why does a sportsman care about the Outdoor Industry Association?
So OIA is the trade association for the outdoor brands and retailers in the industry. We have 1,300 members, and we are really the brands and retailers. So if you think about, larger retailers, we have like a Cabela's or Bass Pro or REI. We've got specialty retailers across the country. And then we have a lot of well-known brands like North Face, Patagonia, Columbia Sportswear, Gore, First Light. So we have this whole broad array of products. And, I think that hunting and fishing and the outdoor community actually have so much crossover. So if you think about Cabela's, a lot of the product categories in Cabela's are the same as you'll see at REI, even though they might be attracting, initially different demographic. But I think where we really found it out was this year, or I guess, within the last couple of years, around the state take-back issue. So whether public lands, should remain public, or should they be transferred to the states or sold off, that type of dialogue that was starting to become more prevalent. And that's where I think the initial issue where you really saw outdoor and the hunting and fishing community have the same opinion and really come together. And it was really unifying. You started to see these rallies at state capitals. So some of those things actually I think were more led by the hunting and fishing community initially.
So you said started to. Is that going away? Are you seeing a decrease in that sort of collaborative action?
No, I don't think so. I just think it had. I don't think it had been as well developed previously.
I think, we talked about this, on our way up here. We were sitting here in the car, and we're, kind of contest about who does more outdoor stuff. And I think the reality is for all of us, the fall, we dream all year about, the opportunity to get out in the mountains and sit on top of a mountain and freeze during October, waiting for a big animal to show up. But the reality is I think that most outdoorsmen, more sportsmen, are generalists. I mountain bike, I climb, I canoe, I shoot bows, I fish. And I think that's just kind of the common, while I think it's convenient for the marketplace sometimes to try and segment the different spots we're going to go buy something at. The reality is I think most of us who are interested in the great outdoors, we're interested in the great outdoors and any excuse to spend time out there.
I agree. And one thing I'd note is based on our discussion in the car, and what you just listed off, I definitely do more outdoor things than
I didn't
you
include
do.
everything. I motocross too.
Well, I don't do that, but when I was in high school, I used to volunteer at motocross tracks for flagging. So when people like you would wipe out, I'd go out there and stand out there with an orange flag so nobody'd run into you.
You did that for money, Dave. You didn't do it because you cared.
I volunteered. I cared. So I wanted to really quick circle back. So talking about this, this rallying effort amongst the groups around this, I think you called it land take back. Right? What kind of momentum do you really think there was behind a push to transfer public lands from federal hands to whether it be private or state hands? I think there's some differing perspectives on just how big that effort was.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when people feel like times are good, and I think this is human nature, and you don't feel like the things that you care about, you might lose, you spend time maybe fighting over things that you wouldn't fight over in a different circumstance. So, having been in this role for a few years, but then also at OIA previous to even my current role, there's always user conflicts. And so, I think about the time that human-powered and the motorized community has spent, like, arguing over different trails. And that's pretty easy to do when you feel like funding's adequate or you're not feeling like there is a real effort to transfer public lands. And so I think what we started to see is that there were some initiatives, and a lot of times they would be coming out of the Utah state legislature suggesting this idea. And but I think the political climate changed. And so something changed where all of a sudden people felt like, hey, these bills have been sitting there for 5 years and no one's really been worried. But now we're in this different political climate. And to me, the best example was Congressman Chaffetz had this bill, for a long time that was transferring some of the federal lands back to the state. And I think he'd introduced it 3 or 4 years, and it had never gone anywhere, and I don't think we'd even done anything. And I don't think anyone else really had cared about it either. And then suddenly he introduced it last year, and it was like it was a brand new piece of legislation. And I think initially the hunting and fishing community in Utah really started raising concerns about his bill, and within like 48 hours suddenly he put this thing on Facebook, him and this hunting dog, like saying, hey, like, I love to hunt,
good looking dog, I'm
pulling this bill. And he actually did this thing which you'd never hear of, is I heard that he went to basically the clerk's office in the House and asked that they take his name off the bill because he couldn't pull it because he had already introduced it, which was pretty much unheard of. So it wasn't something new. I think in the political environment, suddenly people were more fearful than they were in the past, or they felt like, hey, there's more momentum for this.
Do you think they were rightfully fearful? Because it still, whether you have 1 or even 10 congressmen suggesting this transfer, you have 435 members that have to vote on it. Right. And it just didn't strike me as there was anywhere near critical mass to pass a bill that would transfer public lands to federal lands to states.
Yeah, I think that whole dynamic's changed now, because I would agree with you there. But when the Utah legislature first started passing the resolution saying, Bears Ears should be rescinded, Grand Staircase should be rescinded, I'm like, look, it's the Utah legislature. It doesn't have any real enforcement. It's not, they can pass these resolutions, but they're not legal. This would have to happen at the federal level. So I think initially in our community, we thought they've passed these resolutions in the past. This has never happened. And then if we look at what happened now, the monuments were rescinded. Escalante's been cut back. It's going to be, in legal action. So I do think we're in a political climate where things that you didn't think would happen in the past, now you have to say, well, maybe this is a new day and some of these things could happen. And that's where I think you saw the unity. And you saw, to me, like that rally that happened at the Montana Capitol, now probably 18 months ago. I mean, the assembly of people there that normally are sometimes fighting over user issues around certain trails. I mean, you saw the mountain bike community, people from the Blue Ribbon Coalition, hunting and fishing community, people like Conrad Anchor on one side, land on the other. So, I do think we're in a different environment. And I think the thing that's encouraging to me about it, though, is that it can remain a bipartisan issue. And I think we have to be careful not to make it partisan and do our best to not make it that way, because the polling data shows that the public is actually very squarely behind outdoor recreation and the public land system in a very bipartisan way. It's just how we talk about it and that we don't politicize it.
And just to be clear for folks that are listening, when we're talking about public land transfer, I mean, you provided two very distinct, different examples that would require two very different processes. Right? So the Bears Ears and the Grand Staircase Escalante were creations under the Antiquities Act, and so the argument before the court really is, does a president have the executive authority under the Antiquities Act to then change those designations of something that have already been designated, as opposed to this other movement that we were talking about, which would require full-blown congressional action to transfer public lands to the states. That could not be done. We know that cannot be done by an executive action. And so where you're providing an example of, here's something that actually we were afraid that might happen and did happen, it just took one person to do it as opposed to a body of 435, and I think there is a distinction there.
I think the other thing that you were bringing up that kind of provides the layers of complexity is you were talking about how essentially there's been in the past resolutions that went through a state legislative process, which obviously can't impact the federal lands. It's a state decision, but then you mentioned that Representative Chaffetz, who's in the United States Congress, had a bill. And had been there for a little bit, and that really caught some attention. Was it the awakening of this issue? Was it because it went from a state process to a federal bill at introduction?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what it was, and I also think, you have a chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee that may tend towards that view. So people felt like, hey, maybe this is more of a threat than we previously thought it was, and that's where I think you saw threats that people had sort of dismissed as this will never happen start to feel like, well, hey, maybe we're asleep at the wheel here, so we need to step up.
It seems like there's been a pendulum, right? That we've seen this come around in the early 80s, the Sagebrush Rebellion, and then and some would say, and I'm curious at your thoughts on this. Some would say that it's this pendulum action that puts us, that gets us into a bad spot where we see one side, it swings one way, and then the reaction, it gets momentum over there, and then all of a sudden we have a huge gravity where people catch it and they're like, wait a minute, this has gone too far, and all of a sudden that gravity starts dragging back to the other direction, the danger being that it then overruns itself going the other direction, and then we see pushback. And I've heard people say, that they think that maybe this thing that occurred in Utah, maybe this to them, the perception there is like, hey, this is a pendulum because of our feelings of what people have been doing to us, and so we want more control. How do we avoid that? I mean, first of all, do you think that pendulum exists? And second of all, how do we get out of the pendulum if you think that it exists? How do we find this pragmatic, happy medium that is, I believe, is where we ought to live?
Yeah, I mean, now we're going to be really wonky, right, for your listeners.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's this great book called The Gatekeepers that people should think about reading, and it's actually pretty entertaining. It's written about the chiefs of staff for the presidents for, I think, since maybe Eisenhower, and it's just really interesting how things in Washington have changed over that time. And I think that's the root of the problem. Is I do think most Americans want people to compromise, and they want to be somewhere in the middle, and they're reasonable. But then we're electing, the moderates are gone in Congress, and I think it's too bad. And so in this book, it's interesting because I'm really starting somewhat with Clinton, but even more with President Obama. The Congress is so polarized now that it's hard to pass anything. And so I think in his second term, he started doing things by executive order because he couldn't get his policies through Congress. And Congress, I think part of the root cause, and it's been written about, so it's not my idea, is this whole thing around, in the past, when you were elected to Congress, you used to come to town and used to stay there. And used to be friends with people from both parties, and used to socialize with their kids or their wives, and you didn't go home every weekend. And we also didn't have the radio polarization on both sides, or we didn't have MSNBC versus Fox News. And so people actually got behind closed doors and cut deals, and I think that's the way our government's supposed to work. But now that's bad. It's bad if you compromise. And I think that's too bad, because I think if you think about like your relationship with your spouse or how you do things at work, if you took a totally uncompromising position all the time, you'd be divorced and unemployed. But now that's what we've elected.
Well, although I think some of us would say we take an uncompromising approach and we just do what our spouse suggests.
So you've totally compromised. So that might work for you, and that's probably not a bad idea. But yeah, I mean, it's so now what we saw is we have a new president, President Trump, and some of what he's doing is he's just using the executive, his pen to undo what was done by the last executive order.
Yeah, I've heard it called deconstructing the administrative state.
Yeah, and so it swings back and forth, right? And that's where I think our federal government is actually not supposed to work like that. And I think that's why the states are still seen as bastions of hope, because most of the states, even if the legislature is lopsided, they actually do need votes from the other side to get things done. And then the governors are executives, so they actually have to balance the budget and make decisions in real time. And so I think you've seen a lot of the governors come together and work together. And one of the most encouraging things for me was to see Governor Hickenlooper and Governor Meade walk the trade show together and spend a couple hours on the trade show. And then Senators Bennett and Gardner did the same. And to me, it symbolizes this is what this is supposed to look like. And this is why the trade show is now in Colorado, because it's a purple state. And so that's what we think outdoor recreation should be like.
That it's just this blend of for outdoor rec, the idea is you've found that middle, you found that the way to work together and compromise, right? That's kind of what you're getting at.
Well, I think
that's what you hope for it to be.
Yeah, I feel like if we look at the enthusiasts, there's needs to be a place in the middle. And also going outside is awesome. So I don't think necessarily people want to go out and think about politics while they're recreating.
So how big is that outdoor recreation economy? Most people don't know. Like, what's it mean to the U.S. and what is it? What does it encompass, and how big is it?
So we've been doing some reports over the last few years that total consumer spending is about $887 billion. 7.6 million jobs are supported by outdoor recreation around the country. So it's much bigger than people think. It's bigger than a lot of sectors, like healthcare and other things like that. It's much more diffuse, so you don't see it because there's this whole tourism economy that's built around outdoor recreation. And you see, bedroom communities to either a national park or a national recreation area that now we've gotten all these businesses that aren't related to outdoor recreation spring up. I think the other thing is one of the most interesting things to me is like in the Amazon bid for their headquarters 2, which is now going on. In their RFP process, they specified, access to outdoor recreation and access to green space as something they were looking for, because they know if they want to attract an employee base, there's going to be competition for employees, and employees want to live where they can get outside and recreate or have a great, place to live for their families. So I feel like outdoor recreation actually spurs all this other economic activity. The other thing is we are more than 2% of the GDP and growing faster than the GDP overall. So that's the argument we've been trying to make, I think, as a holistic community to Congress and also to states. Is just that if you are looking at growing the economy of your state, outdoor recreation is a good thing to invest in, but it requires investment. And those jobs really can't be outsourced because they're tied to landscapes. so it's a sustainable economy as well.
So define for me an investment. So if you're talking to a state, if you're making a pitch to a state, how would you define what's necessary to invest in an outdoor economy?
I think the thing is you do want to look at what are the natural attributes that you have. And so as you're building, whether you're building houses or you're thinking about how you're building office infrastructure, business infrastructure, are you leaving green space? Are you leaving the opportunity for people to recreate within 10 minutes of their home? So I think a lot of it's close to home recreation. And if you look at how cities are rebuilding urban areas, especially urban areas that have been devastated by economic conditions, you now have young people actually moving back into city centers, but they actually want to maybe not even own a car, so they'd prefer to be able to get out and recreate near their houses. And then there's all these other studies out there that just show the ability to get outside helps improve health and wellness, but also people's mental well-being, kids' grades, that type of thing. So you hear these things about how someone will take their child in because they're hyperactive, and you could write them a prescription for Ritalin, and in maybe some cases that's needed, but in other times the doctor will just write a prescription saying, hey, go to the park 3 times a day and here's your park, or 3 times a week and here's the address to the park near your home. And so you hear more stories about that.
So I'd like to meet that doctor and be able to give that to my boss.
or the wife when it's time to go hunting.
Yes, that'd be a good thing too.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting though? Like you talked about Amazon, and really that's the case. I think for most of the people listening to this podcast, and certainly for us, the reason that you're listening to this podcast right now, listener, is probably because you're sitting at your desk and you're working. And and most of us, I think, we like the things that we value in our life. It's great to have a good job, but what you value is that opportunity. As you're sitting there, you probably spend a whole bunch of time dreaming about your next escape, and both backcountry and front country recreation is what you're going to be doing. And so for me, maybe not for Dave, who just abandons his family for about 60 days a year to go hunting, but for
84
Mike,
last year.
Yeah, but for Mike
but
and
who's
I,
counting?
But for Mike and I, it's that week or two, and then all the planning that goes into that, the morning runs, the whatever it takes to get prepared for that backcountry experience where you get to go reacquaint yourself with the wild every once in a while. That just is critical to centering a person and making you feel normal.
Well, it gets back to that old adage of do you live to work or work to live, right? And in your industry, it's probably, well, maybe work, maybe it's a little of both for you. Maybe you enjoy work so much that it doesn't feel like work. But I always think it's work to live. I want to enjoy what I'm doing because that work part is a big part of my life. I want to enjoy what I'm doing, but I want to be able to have the resources and time and flexibility to be able to do what I really want to do, which isn't just hunting.
That's sure, Dave. So
when I counted my 84 days last year, I wasn't counting just hunting. That included fishing too.
You're kind of my idol because of this commitment to. So don't
and
spoil
backpacking and taking my daughters camping. I count all of those on days. It's just days in the field, days out.
So you talked about I used the term backcountry and front country. So front country being close to your home, backcountry being what we all value in terms of the way out there opportunity. You guys are really strong advocates of land. Of a lot of people know LWCF, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and of course, there are both backcountry and front country components of that. Do you mind talking a little bit about why you think that why is LWCF important to your organization, and what are your thoughts on it, both stateside or federal, which I think a lot of people so LWCF has these two components. There's the federal side, which is largely land acquisitions, and of course there's the state side component, which gets handed out. It goes through a funding formula, goes to states and gets spent on more local projects like boat ramps, like community, whether it's a softball field or a trailhead. So could you talk a little bit about LWCF and for you guys what that is? What's your position on that?
Sure. I think it's the best program like people have never heard of. So I think one of the things that bothers me about LWCF is just I feel like we've done a really poor job branding it. Because if you go to a park or a trail or usually like a kid's soccer field, any ball fields near your homes, almost positive there's LWCF money in it, but you don't know that. So I think part of it is we need to get the word out. And it's kind of ironic because it's been in place now for, I think, 60 years. And so the idea behind it was that when there was offshore oil and gas drilling, there would be a conservation royalty paid. And so it would be collected so that it could go back into preserving wild places at the federal level, but also building close to home recreation opportunities. And I think one of the most disappointing things for me is just that Congress has only properly funded it once or fully funded it once in the entire 60-year history. It's like they got $900 million.
I thought they did it twice. I thought they did it like 2001 and then one time before 2000.
Maybe the federal got funded. I don't know if it's gotten it more recently.
There was one time
900.
where it hit. I thought it hit. Is it an 8 or 900 million?
It's supposed to be 900. Yeah.
I thought
the percentages are not high. Let's just leave it there. It's
but yeah, it one maybe 2 times max. It just never hits that, and it's usually half of that.
Well, yeah, because what happens is it's not dedicated, so the appropriators spend the money doing other things that have nothing to do with land. So the idea was that was going to be a dedicated funding stream. So every year we all come together and advocate for this. We asked for full funding. Maybe we've gotten it once or twice, but now we're really under the gun because it's actually the program is set to expire. And so if that happens, we won't get any funding from it any longer. And the program was going to expire, I think, 2 years ago or last year, and then we got a reprieve for a year. There is discussion about what's the proper split between federal and state, and we've always been one of the organizations strongly advocating for state funding because it requires a match a lot of times. And I do think that if you are new to going outside or you didn't have your family that took you outside, you're not just going to suddenly drive out to the wilderness and start hiking around out there. I mean, that's a big leap. Or if you want to learn how to fish or you want to learn how to rock climbing, you want to go on your first hunting trip, you need someone to take you. Those are things that it's probably unlikely. Maybe you're a super innovative person, but most people feel more comfortable going with a mentor. And so you're going to get used to the outdoors just by going near your house and feeling comfortable. Like there's a fear of the outdoors sometimes, so that it's going to be safe. It's going to be a good experience. Like you're not going to get hurt. You're not going to be lost, and that's much more comfortable in a park near your home than just heading out into the wilderness. But I think after people are used to going outside, then they're like, okay, yeah, I'm going to do this weekend backpacking trip, or then I'm going to move to the week-long trip. So, I think it's about creating the outdoors so that we can experience it every day instead of we have to wait till vacation to go outside.
I've got to really quickly take you on a tangent because you talked about there's some fear of the outdoors for people, and I think you're absolutely right. So when I was in college, I had 2 friends, both from actually one was from rural Nebraska, one was from Indianapolis, or so big city. I actually thought the one from rural Nebraska would really enjoy going on an outdoor experience. So I took the 2 of them up to a mountain range near campus, and we were going into a wilderness area just for a day hike. And the idea was we're going to take this trail along a ridge for a while, and then we're going to have to drop off the trail to get down to a creek to do a little bit of fishing, and then we'll fish our way upstream back to where we parked. So we hiked in for about a mile and a half, and they were a little uncomfortable just with that. And when I took them off trail and started bushwhacking, we made it about, a couple hundred yards before they just stopped, and it was just, that's it. I'm not going any farther. We have to go back. They were just absolutely dead set that they were going to get lost out there, or that they were going to get attacked by a bear or something, and so we had to turn back and go, back the way we came out. So, the point you make on being scared of the outdoors and potentially needing mentorship. I evidently was not the right mentor to get him over this hurdle, but the need for that is
maybe you should have stayed on the trail for the first time out.
I did for like a mile and a half. I thought that got him pretty comfortable.
I'm going to go with you're not a great mentor.
Well, I'm not hunting with you anymore then.
No, I think it's a really interesting question. I feel like there's less mentorship going on over the last 20 years than there was maybe previous to that. And I mean, maybe it's just my opinion, but I'd love to know if you have some metrics on that. Because I know for me, a lot of guys, a lot of people grew up with specific organizations that were like mentor organizations where they take, kids out and do certain stuff. And I think that there's a lot more competition now from a Nintendo or the PlayStation. And I'm wondering if, is there a need for that? And then how do you get people to do it?
Yeah, I mean, we have a foundation that's focused on increasing participation. So that's our C3. And I mean, we're redoing our strategy right now because we're trying to figure that out. Because one thing we've been doing is just giving like $3,000, $5,000, $10,000 grants to local community groups to take kids outside. So I mean, I think there's a couple things people know, which is if you just take kids outside one time and you bus them to a national park, that's like that one-off experience probably is not going to do it. And you're also more likely if you can establish a network in their community. And so it doesn't even have to be an outdoor group initially, though it could be like the Scouts or something. But you could say, hey, it's a church group. Now you're going to take the church group of the people who are interested in going outdoors and say, let's take them outside a few times, and then they start to go outside on their own, right? So you have to find what are the organizations in the community that already exist and are embedded and have a wide network. That's partly the way to do it. I think the other thing is you can't shy away from the fact that more people live in urban areas now. So maybe they didn't grow up on a farm, or they weren't going outside all the time. So you've got to create urban opportunities and then broaden the definition of what it means to go outside. So I think, in our industry, we're guilty of always showing, the high peak or the blizzard conditions or how hard it's going to be and that you're going to suffer. And that's, the
maybe fun stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Second degree fun.
Yeah, second degree frostbite. So, we've got to say like, hey, actually going outside is fun with your friends. And it's, maybe you're just hanging out at the park or you're just going on this short hike or this bike ride around town. And that's just as legitimate as climbing Mount Everest. And so not put judgment on what it means to go outside. And I think our industry in the past has maybe done too much of that.
How do you get away from that, though? I mean, I understand you have your C3, but you represent all of these companies that are part of your association, and I can tell you, I still see the ads for a lot of these companies, and it's all about It's about adventures. It's still about the high peaks. It's still about pushing your limits and challenging yourself. And so, how do you?
It's aspirational brands, right? Aspirational branding.
Yeah, I think it's aspirational, and I think it does work to some degree because some people are just going to buy the shell to wear around the city when it's raining. But I also think if you look at the marketing and brands advertisements over time, I think they have shifted to show more social aspect to being outside. And I think that's really important for the generation we have now because I think there's a lot more social aspect than it used to be. And I also think there was a lot of conversation in the past around too much screen time, and that's an issue that's still being discussed. I think our industry actually is an antidote to that to some degree. However, it's not an either or. So if people go outside and they post it on Instagram and their friends see it, that's like a part of what our world does now. And we all do that too. So you show your 84 days of hunting there when you get back. So, I think that's just accepting like the definition of what it means to go outside has changed. And I don't think we have the formula right, but I think we have to get it right because going back to our earlier discussion, we want more people to get outside because you only care about the experiences you've had. So you're not going to advocate for these places if you've never gone to them or you can't even envision. Like, we want people to advocate for the Arctic. That's a really far place that not a lot of people are ever going to go to, but you have to have a reason why you care, and it's probably because you have some vision of what that could be.
I know we wanted to talk more about this, but I feel like we didn't do enough justice to LWCF. I really do. Do you mind if we talk a little bit more
Sure.
about that? And then we can come back Is that fine, Nephi?
Hey, I'm great with that. I just want to know, like, I'm interested how you're going to make this more entertaining, because I'm ready to be entertained.
Well, then maybe you should take your headset off and we'll all be more entertained. So talking about, because I felt like we left something hanging out there on LWCF, because you're talking about this need or desire to see it funded, and it hasn't been. It really hasn't been. One of the things that I'm kind of interested in your response to is I think there are folks out there. One of the reasons it hasn't been, and one of the challenges to getting it authorized, whether permanently or for at least more than a few years at a time, is this idea that the federal government shouldn't be expanding its land holdings at a time where it doesn't have the resources to maintain its current land holdings. And how do we reconcile those two things? Because we hear about backlogs, maintenance backlogs all over the place. In the Park Service, in national, in the wildlife, the National Refuge system. We hear about backlogs or inadequate funding for endangered species recovery, that sort of thing. So how do we reconcile this one thought of we shouldn't see any more an increase in public land holdings until we solve our current funding shortages for what we've got?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why we've always advocated strongly for both federal and state side. But I think where you see the land acquisition happening on the federal side is mostly around, like, you're buying in holdings or you're buying access to federal property that already exists. So, I mean, I'd have to go back and look, but I'm not sure there's huge land purchases that are just completely adding new huge properties to the federal system. I think a lot of it could be more along the lines of you're buying the right of way to get people to the trail.
I think the total additions in the LWCF history is something like 5 million acres. That's not an insignificant number.
No, but when you consider the entire size of the federal estate, right?
Sure.
So over, whether it's been in 50 states or not, I don't know. But I mean, that's definitely, I think there's challenges all around because we aren't properly maintaining the lands that we have. And so one thing that that really bothers me, and I think bothers a lot of people who do advocacy work in this area, is, over the last decade, discretionary spending on basically the part of the budget that's discretionary, so that's not going to entitlement programs. It used to be 2% was spent on maintaining, our public land system, whether it went to the Department of Interior or the Forest Service. Now we're down at 1%. So we're losing ground, because really that's what we're fighting over now, is how to spend the discretionary dollars that Congress has. And so we're losing ground. And then what you see is campgrounds that aren't maintained, or lands that are not taken care of, and we see these wildfires and that type of thing. I mean, one of the big wins that we had this year on a policy front was getting the wildfire fix. And that was Mike Simpson from Idaho that really led the fight on that, along with a lot of other people. And, there was this bill signing or celebration at NIFWIF in Idaho, or the National Interagency Fire Center in Boise, that Senator Wyden came to. And then Risch and Simpson were both there. And to me, that's a bipartisan effort, because basically what was happening is that every time there was wildfire out west, or really in any other place in the country, but a lot of times out west, because the wildfires are so big here and so much public lands, that projects that were being, in place had been started. Maybe they were going to be started, whether it was a trail project or campground or just some other maintenance project, immediately would be halted, because those funds would be pulled from other accounts. So I think it's such a complicated answer, but I think, unfortunately, we have not been funding our public lands properly, and it is, I feel like Congress has not necessarily kept their commitment to our public land system. And I look at things like the Land and Water Conservation Fund, where that's easy, because that is dedicated funding that's coming in every year. And that account, they could simply do what they promised to do 60 years ago. So,
But they could do that with a lot of accounts of what they promised to do 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years ago. Congress is pretty notorious for, robbing Peter to pay Paul, right?
Yeah,
And so how do we solve that conundrum? Because if you do it for LWCF, then you're going to have a whole constituency saying, if you're going to do it for them, you should do it for us. And now we're back. Now we're getting into earmarks, right? In some ways, we're getting into earmarks. And how do we, from a general Treasury dollar standpoint, how do we do that?
This brings up a real interesting side note that and Harry, we want to talk to you about as well. America, I think everybody in this room agrees that I think we've got it right with wildlife management. We really were screwing it up at the turn of the between the 18th and 19th century, and then sportsmen sat down and looked at the resource that we had and said, we're not going to have anything left, and kind of in that spirit of Teddy Roosevelt, they all came together and said, we're going to tax ourselves 10% or roughly on firearms, ammunition, fishing gear, boat fuel, things like that. We're gonna do that so that we have this chunk of money that now we call the Pittman-Robertson funding or Dingell-Johnson funding that now goes, and a lot of people don't know this. It accounts for, what is it, Dave? about $1 billion in 2017 went back to wildlife and habitat conservation. Where the recreationists in that community decided to, they said we're gonna dedicate this money, and if the state tries to steal it to use it for something else, they don't get it. So there are people that have mentioned the idea of the outdoor recreation community coming together and doing something similar, and I think people have called it in the past. The idea first came up, they said, well, let's do a backpack tax. So first of all, what are your thoughts about a big chunk of your constituency, outdoor recreation, are those sportsmen? It's hunters, fishers, motorboat, those types of people. So you've got that part of your constituency that's done that. What are your thoughts about, tell us about the backpack tax and what your thoughts were.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that one of the smartest things that, the community did in Pittman-Robertson was to say that the money should go back to the states, through the formula that it gets dispersed, because I think that ensured that money was going to happen, so we didn't have an LWCF situation where there's this conservation royalty. Because, if I'm the oil and gas industry, I wouldn't really like it that I'm paying this conservation royalty, because they're the ones paying it, and it's going into this account, but it's actually not going to the purpose. So they actually haven't been able to, even if they wanted to go out and talk about it from a PR standpoint, they're unable to do it really in any large magnitude. I think one of the things that people don't know is that on outdoor products that are coming into the U.S., and it's really right now on apparel and footwear, there's a really high tax at the border. So there's highly tariffed. So right now we're paying about $750 million a year on outdoor products. Actually, Columbia Sportswear is the 49th highest tariff payer in the U.S., which is kind of mind-boggling to me. Against all the other companies in the U.S. And so for instance, like on performance outerwear, so I was talking like ski jackets and pants, rain jackets, there's a 28% tax at import.
That's why I only wear ponchos.
You're probably paying. It's anything that's waterproof, breathable.
It might be, but my poncho is like $4. So.
Dave's his has hefty.
Yours
on
is
it.
just a rubber, yeah. You might not have a tax on yours.
I climbed Cloud Peak in the Bighorns of Northern Wyoming last summer to the 13,000, or we don't have 14ers like you do in Colorado, but I climbed that, and I got in on the climb. We got into spitting snow, rain, sleet, and I had this poncho on with a big tear in the side.
It's called a trash bag.
Yeah.
Dave and I have this. I made an agreement with him because I truthfully, there's nothing I love more than gear. All forms of gear, I love it. And then Dave is on the opposite side of the spectrum for me, so we weren't going to make fun of each other for this. But he just makes it too easy.
It's self-inflicted. I don't want to pay the tariff. That's what it boils down to.
Well, you should want to pay well, here's the question: would you should that tariff?
Okay, so what shoes do you wear
when I hike? Yeah, I actually that's the one. I'm not going to pitch a brand or anything, but that's the one thing where I don't spare an expense. Where
And
my feet are the most important part.
So they've got a
on
gore.
hike.
They have a gore lining
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah, they do.
I'm sure. Well,
They have a membrane.
They have a membrane. So the tariff on that was 37.5%.
Yeah.
Right. So
Which
looks
brings
like
me
I'm
to
going
a
to start
question.
making my shoes.
so yes. So if they took that 750 million and gave it to the department, basically DOI, or they wanted to give it back to the states, or give it to public land management agencies, great. Because right now it's just going to the general treasury. So I think that's where you see people's wariness to make the products more expensive, because even with Pittman Robertson, right, it's a pass on to the consumer because you see it on the sales tax receipt. And then there's no doubt when tariffs are, I think the average tariff in our industry is 14%. And then, like I said, ski jackets, a 28, waterproof shoes, 37.5. When it gets to the consumer, it's a lot. It's $100.
So have you made a push for the tariff to be looped back into a dedicated funding
No,
source?
I mean, we think that would be a tall hurdle because there's not a lot of precedent in Congress for doing that. They haven't necessarily redirected tariffs in that way. I mean, what we've tried to say is, look, we're paying $65 billion, which is the federal tax generated by outdoor recreation. We've got $750 million in tariffs, and then each year you are actually spending, less as a percentage of the discretionary budget on public lands. And this is kind of my overall philosophy is I feel like and I've talked to Whit Fosberg from TRCP about this, is my fear is we give our land management agencies more dedicated funding. I feel like Congress will take the funds and we'll have exactly the same amount of money we do now.
So that's why you need something like a Pittman Robertson style act where they can't rob that account.
So do we think that Congress as a whole, do we think our public land system is something we want to support, all of us, or are we just going to have user fees? Because, of course, there are user fees now, like if you camp or you park at the trailhead and all of this other stuff. But I'm just saying, no one comes to me and says, would you like to would you like part of your taxes to go to support the national defense? No. I don't, they're not going around and asking people, what would you like to pay for, right? There's certain things that I feel like that Congress said, or that the idea is that this is an American system, that Congress should properly fund it, and we're just getting out lobbied.
So here's
we need to do better. We need to come together as a community and say, going from 2% to 1% is not okay, because that means that someone else got our 1%, some other industry, and so we're getting beat there.
So when does the tariff kick in on these products?
It's been in place for years.
No, but I mean, is it just imports of goods from foreign goods, or
just at import, which almost all definitely performance outerwear and things like that are all offshore now.
So American-made products are not going to get the tariff unless they are using things that were imported.
Which is why American-made.
So the tariffs I'm talking about right now are there's no domestic production of any of those items. Okay. There's actually the tariffs our industry pays are much bigger, but there's so tariffs are in place sometimes when there's domestic production, which I think is appropriate. And having worked for Micron, I used to lobby on the other side all the time. So I think the tariffs we pay are actually way more than $1 billion because there's domestic production of some garments, not so much, but some footwear still. And then there's some equipment, but not too much.
So I kind of have a two-part follow-up question for you. So first of all, there's a push going on within the community. And I'm sure it's led by the industry, called 2% for conservation. Mm-hmm. And here in Colorado, there's some folks that are working on that, which is a voluntary program to take. And maybe you can elaborate on it, you're familiar with it, but have your thoughts about that 2% for conservation. And then the other question I have for you is, to be fair, OIA represents the industry, and obviously members of the industry, those are the folks that when you look at having to pay that bill, that tariff bill, or having to collect that tax, it's you guys that are directly impacted by that. And I wanted to know what if the consumer if it was the voice of the consumer that was saying, just kind of like it was with the sportsman, saying, no, this is important enough, we're going to dedicate funding, we're going to make it happen. Do you think that OIA would have a different perception of that effort? Would they, what's your thoughts on that?
I think where it would be very difficult is in trying to define which products, because what's the end use? And so, it might just end up being on equipment, because I think it's going to be really hard to define the end use of apparel and footwear. And if you try to define it by the makeup of the material, I mean, what are you going to say, 90% polyester, right? Because that could also be like your suit. So I think that's where it would be difficult.
Which for me, if somebody were to tell me, Nephi, do you want 1% of your suit to go to conservation so you can have better hunting and fishing? I'd be like, absolutely.
I mean, we do have
Give me a new suit.
We have things right now like 1% for the planet, right? So that's being collected. We have companies that are giving 1% of their product sales away to groups that do work, but it's just in the private sector, but it's more on the NGO side, right? So I feel like there's a lot of information that's not out there, about how all these different funds get generated. So whether we're talking about the tariffs or we're talking about like the $65 billion already being paid, I also feel like the end users that are enjoying public lands are already paying, right? So we just had this big debate over whether, like, how much to increase the entrance fees to the national parks, and there was a proposal out there, to increase them to $70, and it's okay. Well, now, did you just make a pretty large barrier for people to go visit the parks, right? That's a pretty hefty amount when people are comparing, like, what are you going to do on your weekend? Are you going to go bowling, or are you going to go to the national park, right? So, like, we're just competing for people's time, free time. So the industry has done some things, like, the 1% for the planet's been in place forever. And those are companies actually up in Canada doing that as well. And they're just spending it in different ways. So I think it's not going to the federal government. It's going to groups that maybe go out and do trail work and that type of thing. I think the other proposal that is super interesting, that kind of gets to your question, that we are taking a positive stand on this year, is there's a ballot initiative that's going to be on the ballot in Georgia. It actually went through the legislature, so the legislature passed the bill to place this initiative for the voters of Georgia to decide. And it would take the sales tax that's now being collected on outdoor gear and say that sales tax on outdoor gear should go to the Georgia park system. And that's something that we do favor. So I think for redirection of the funds that we're already paying, which of course consumers are paying, that's something we see, that is a dedicated funding source. I mean, the way Colorado has the lottery, that's a bit different because that's a tax on just people buying lottery tickets.
So I wrote, I want to say one thing and then I have two questions for you, and then we really got to let you go because we've used up a lot of your time. But,
all right.
So I wrote an article a couple of years ago, a law review article that seems like it's very much in line with that Georgia proposal. My suggestion was how do we tap into the I hate to say non-consumptive user, because everybody's a consumptive user in some way. Mm-hmm. There's no non-impact activity in the outdoor sphere, right? But how do we tap into the non-hunters and anglers and kind of this Pittman-Robertson idea? And the suggestion I'd made was something along those lines, that we run an analysis, and I had an economist I was working with who ran that analysis and said, here's the amount of tax revenue generated by the outdoor industry in Wyoming. Now let's take 1% of that, or whatever number it was of that, and redirect that. So just identify it, mark it, redirect it to a specific purpose rather than raising new fees. And we came up with a couple of accounts to pull it from so it wouldn't have an impact on general fund, other appropriated users. But so that sounds like something that your group would generally support conceptually. Devil's in the details, obviously, but
yeah, I mean, I feel like that's the argument we've been trying to make with doing the rec economy report. Is look, we're like, this is how much we're paying, and so we're paying in these different ways, whether it's through just the federal tax that gets paid, whether it's through sales tax at the state level, or whether we have things like tariffs. And But even though our contribution, and I mean outdoor recreation, so it's all of us, has been increasing, and we're now 2% of the GDP and growing faster than the GDP, the response, it seems like, from the policymakers has actually been to cut the funding for the infrastructure that supports it. So we're going to continue to go in and argue, and this is where I think we can all come together and say, hey, like, this is a growing economy. It creates sustainable jobs. They can't be outsourced. They're tied to, a new economy for the future in lots of rural communities where maybe the mine is closed or logging is not as prevalent as it used to be, and they're looking for a new way to keep the kids living there and create, new jobs in their communities. But you also have to, you have to look at what's in a growing economy and invest back into the resource. And right now, that's out of whack. Like, we do not see that happening. So with that, to me, is we need to continue to make the argument until we do see it, until we do see that happening, and otherwise we, haven't done our job well enough.
I think you've got employment as long as you want it,
yeah,
based on where we are in this.
Exactly.
So 2-part question to end this. First question: What has been your most impactful experience in the outdoors in your life? And second question. So while you're thinking about that, second question, you're on the Your Mountain podcast, and we want to know, what's your mountain? What's that place today that means the most to you, personally? So there's your 2-part question.
You didn't give any heads up on any of this.
It's right here in the outline we sent you.
Most impactful experience in the outdoors. I would say, I don't know if I can just come up with one, but I would say it's been, the time outdoors with friends, like where we've done, a difficult peak. And I'd say maybe one of the most memorable experiences was we did a ski trip through the Sierras in the springtime, and it was 5 nights, and we were carrying everything on our backs. And so it was on the John Muir Trail underneath the Palisades, which was amazing because in the summer it's probably permitted and would be packed with people, and we were the only people back there for 5 days. And so it was so much work because our packs were so heavy. And in the very end, we had to hike out into the desert, like in our ski boots over talus, which was terrible. But, that was one of the best backcountry experiences I ever had. And I think it goes like the solitude piece, but also just like team effort, working hard with friends. And I think to the fear factor, we actually had this woman on our trip that I didn't know, who was a police officer, I think somewhere in LA. And she basically was assigned to the gang unit. And so she was pretty tough, I thought.
So you think she wouldn't be scared of anything?
No,
right?
And one night we had to camp on the lake, and it was frozen solid, and she was in tears because she was afraid, we were going to fall in. And so I think it goes to show, like, people's fears are, because I would have not wanted her job for anything. And I think for the place that means the most for me now is just, I would say it is being able to get out into the backcountry on a powder day, being able to hike back there and ski on your own. So
that's general enough without giving away your
spot. Where.
We always try and find out where.
Yeah.
But nobody to date, nobody's told us where.
Well, I have one final question too, and I know Dave wanted to end, but hey, it seems like we're all in this together. I like to use the tent analogy. How do we keep from kicking each other out of the tent when it starts to rain? How do we keep all our diverse sportsmen's groups, or
outdoor groups?
Yeah. How do we keep all of our diverse interests under the tent and pulling in the same direction?
Yeah, it sounds like a really obvious answer, but I think a lot of it is just having respect for like all sorts of different activities that people do outside, and not saying like one activity is better than the other. But I think the other thing is just the relationship. I think there's been some really strong relationships built over the last 2 years for the reasons we talked about at the beginning, like feeling like, hey, some of the things we care about at a very base level may be under threat. And so I think it is being able to, pick up the phone and say, hey, I'm thinking about this idea. I know you guys might not like that, but can we get together and talk about it? And I think that's where the industry is. So when you look at who comes to Outdoor Retailer now, I think it's a lot more diverse audience from a user perspective. I think our next step, and, I know this is being talked about, is just making sure that we have a next generation that looks more like what America is going to look like. And I think we have a lot of work to do on the participation side if we actually want a lot of the work we're doing now to be sustained in the future. And I do think that's one initiative that we can all work on together, that everyone agrees, like, hey, we need a lot more diverse population of people who care about these activities and are out there, in the outdoors. So I think some of it is finding, like, what are some common ground to start with, and let's work on those issues. And then on the issues that we don't necessarily have consensus on, it becomes easier to find consensus on issues once you have that trust built. And so, I think that's the opportunity.
All right.
Well, I just keep having more questions. We got to end it, but I want to ask, you brought something up. I want to know when the next Outdoor Retailer show is.
Yeah, so it's going to be the last week of July in Denver. So we hope you guys will come. Hope we'll see you there.
I probably will. Well, last beginning or the end of the last week or the full week.
Oh, are you going to be like doing?
I've got a backpacking trip scheduled. I'm climbing Gannett Peak in the Winds.
Oh, good for you!
Yeah, in late July. So
are you taking your poncho or?
I probably will.
Yeah. You might want to do a little better than that on that peak.
We'll see. You like to have a story to tell at the end of a climb.
Dave likes to flirt with disaster. It makes it more appealing to him.
I think the less you take, the better your story is at the end if you make it back. But no, so anyway, is it at the beginning or the end, or is it the whole week?
I think it's like around July 24th or so.
Okay.
So.
Well, we're going to try and get there.
Yeah.
Show up.
All right.
Well, Amy, thank you so
Amy,
much.
thank you.
Really
Thanks a lot,
appreciate
you guys.
your time. Appreciate it.
It was fun.
This has been the Your Mountain Podcast, and we'll talk to you next time.
Mike here from the Your Mountain Podcast. We need a favor. Go on our website, itsyourmountain.com, and find the links to Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram so that you can like and follow us, and also so that you can share us with your friends. Wherever you got this podcast from, go ahead and click subscribe, rate us, and leave a comment. These simple things would really help us get the word out. That's itsyourmountain.com. Thanks for the help.